Rick's a retired Alaska Fish and Game wildlife biologist. He worked for ADF&G for 38 years, including 17 years as area biologist for Anchorage, managing wildlife in the Anchorage Bowl and Chugach State Park. And I'm going to remind everybody that we're recording this, so just so everybody knows. Rick earned his bachelor's degree in wildlife management from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then a master's in wildlife biology from the University of Missouri. In 2017, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Alaska Conservation Foundation. Since retiring in 2010, he has been studying Alaskan butterflies and managing 5 wild grandchildren. And I understand that Rick might give a program next year for Olay on butterflies, so that's something I'm going to want to show up for. For those of you in the back, you know, we're going to have a number of slides with text, some of the issues we're discussing, so you may want to move up a little bit, up to you. So Rick, without any further ado, it's all yours.
Okay, now can everyone hear me on this mic? Okay. Always helps to turn them on. So, Alaska's intensive wildlife management. So the Department of Fish and Game manages all terrestrial wildlife in Alaska, so the land mammals and birds in Alaska, right? And we're only going to be talking really about 6 species today. These are 5 here on the screen. There's a black bear, brown bear, grizzly bear, same thing. A caribou, moose, wolf, and then black-tailed deer, Sitka black-tailed deer, which are not shown on here. But keep in mind that an unintended consequence of intensive management's focus on these 6 species is that intensive management also affects many other species. You can't increase moose, for example, or caribou or deer without affecting other species of birds and mammals, and you can't shoot lots of wolves and bears without altering natural ecosystems. I point this way or this way? Ha! Okay. So, a little bit of background. Humans and wild predators compete for limited resources, limited prey animals in Alaska. And here are 3 wild predators in Alaska. So our estimates are
There we go. Thank you.
about 100,000 black bears, 30,000 grizzly or brown bears, and about 10,000 wolves. So there's no more than about 141,000 bears and wolves in Alaska. This way, sorry. Moses has got me. He's covering me. Okay, 141 bears and wolves, but there's 730 Alaska residents, 30,000. About 100,000 people buy hunting licenses annually, and that's a minimum number because people under 18, people over 59 aren't required to buy them. So about 12 to 14% of Alaskans are licensed hunters, and they have about a 24% success rate for moose. It's a little bit higher, I'm sure, for caribou and deer. I haven't seen that, but so, you know, it's fairly low success rate. Next. I'm skipping that last bit, although I had time to say it, didn't I? Moses, can you go on? Okay, sorry. Ooh, that's not me. It's the New World Order taking over. Okay, so a wolf that's unable to find food dies, but a hunter who fails to shoot a moose or caribou complains to his or her legislator, and that's a lot of votes. All right, next one. So let's go, wolves have evolved to kill large prey animals like moose, caribou, and deer. Can we? Gotcha. So let's just take a brief second to look at this chart. So a scientist, Messier, compiled a bunch of studies that had looked at the moose density on the lower there, gets higher as it goes to the right, and killing rate of moose on, wolves on moose on the left-hand thing. And he found that at low levels, down here, I'm looking at the left side here, 0 to 5 moose density. So wolves are killing between 1/2 and 2 moose per 100 days, right? At moderate to higher densities, these studies found that the wolves were killing 2 to 3 moose per 100 days. So that translates to about 7 to 11 moose per year. So wolves can kill a lot of moose. That's sort of a maximum level. Obviously, they eat other things. They don't always just eat moose, but that's kind of a maximum rate. And bears are much less adept at killing adult animals, but they can be significant predators of calves and fawns. So the assumption in the last graph is that every adult wolf kills some moose, caribou, or deer every year, but not every Alaskan human does, because we have other sources of meat, right? So take-home message here on the left-hand side is that about 85% of the meat Alaskans eat is imported, beef and pork, and about 6% is caribou, about 5% is moose, and 1% deer. We do grow a little bit of beef and pork, and then there's your reindeer sausages over there. So this is another way to look at it. The amount of wild game meat that you eat depends on where you live, partly at least. So if you look at the sort of all the columns to the right of the first one, so all of these, that's rural areas, different rural areas in the state. And people eat a lot of wild products out there. So the blue is salmon, the red is other fish, halibut, stuff like that. The purple is moose, caribou, and deer. So on average, of all these rural areas, about 60 pounds of moose, caribou, and deer are eaten per year. And in urban areas, which is basically Anchorage, Mat-Su, Fairbanks for the most part, that's where most of the people are, that's way down here. Something like 20 or so total, and about 5 pounds of moose, caribou, or deer eaten per year. So individually, humans don't eat much wild game, but collectively we do eat a lot. Let's switch gears a little bit and look at the principles and the process of game management in Alaska. So here's 5 wildlife management concepts that I want you all to understand, at least a little bit, so that we can talk about the other stuff. So a population is a group of animals of the same species living in an area that... Well, phew, yeah, I sure do. Thanks, John. I saw you waving your arms. I didn't know what you were talking about. A group of animals of the same species living in an area that can be managed as a discrete entity. So think a herd of caribou, like the Nelchina herd, Mulchatna herd, or say all the moose on the Kenai Peninsula. It's a discrete entity. So populations have characteristics like birth rates and death rates that can be measured or estimated, is what we usually do. But wild animals are difficult and expensive to count, and for traditional management, all we had to know was whether the population was increasing or decreasing over time, or whether it was more or less stable. Pretty low hurdle there. Limiting factors. So limiting factors, populations cannot increase forever because there are limiting factors, right? So environmental factors that limit the number of animals in a population include food, obviously, water, minerals, cover, parasites, diseases, accidents, falling through the ice, and predators. If we go down to sustained yield, I'm sorry, carrying capacity. Next one down. Next one down. I'm clicking the forward button, aren't I? Oh, that's too far. I'm going back. Okay. Carrying capacity. This is the number of animals in a defined area, in other words, a population, that the ecosystem can sustainably support. And of course, this carrying capacity changes every year because the limiting factors in the environment also fluctuate from year to year. It's hard to pin down. Sustained yield is when wildlife populations are harvested by humans under controlled circumstances, the human harvest removes some of the annual surplus, the young that are born every year, that will otherwise die from starvation, predators, etc., from the other limiting factors. But because of annual reproduction, the population recovers the loss every year. That's the plan. And maximum sustained yield. So this is the point beyond which a population tips into an unsustainable level. and that can ultimately lead to a collapse in the population's numbers. It's a very common objective for commercial fisheries management, and that's why many or most commercial fisheries in the world are overharvested, because it's hypothetical. Anyone who thinks the population can be managed at maximum sustained yield in the real world doesn't know how to manage wildlife. And even managing populations for just sustained yield can be tricky because humans have little or no control over most of a population's limiting factors. Can't control the weather, climate change, and it's difficult and expensive to augment food, water, stuff like that. And then finally, a caveat: Fish and Game manages populations, not individual animals. Actually working now. So briefly, here's a few wildlife, these are traditional wildlife management tools, right? I won't go through all of them, but basically these are things that manage hunters. You can open and close hunting areas, you can increase or shorten hunting seasons. I'm going to skip down. You can restrict harvest by antler size, you can limit the number of hunters by permits or by closures, and you can limit methods and means, like you can require them to use archery, which is a more difficult thing, and that lowers the success rate. Or you can manage the food supply. You can restore or create habitat, or you can supplement the food supply. And Montana used to throw out hay for their elk, and maybe they still do. It's expensive and not the best way to do it, but they do it. And then finally, manage predators, control predators. That's a traditional use that wildlife managers have done forever in Alaska. So the history of predator control in Alaska is federal agents were controlling predators in the 1940s and 1950s when Alaska was a territory to increase the numbers of moose, caribou, reindeer, black-tailed deer, and Dall sheep. They shot wolves from airplanes, they paid bounties to hunters and trappers for dead wolves, and also seals, eagles, and rainbow trout even, and poisoned wolves, bears, lynx, wolverines, coyotes, eagles, and many other predators and scavengers. Poisoning was a big thing. That was very efficient back then. Had other problems, of course. The new state of Alaska outlawed poison and bounties, but continued wolf control sporadically. All right, due to intensive levels of predator control and also lots of wildfires and low levels of hunting, moose populations were high in the 1960s and 1970s, but began declining in the 1980s as habitat decreased and hunters increased. But hunters in the 1990s still remembered the good old days. And nothing happens in a vacuum. So the number of hunters was increasing. Most are unsuccessful, as I pointed out. Only about 1 in 4 moose hunters get a moose every year. So for over a century, the solution has always been to reduce the number of predators. Okay, let's briefly look at this. This was a very important study published in the early 1990s. It's the thing that many wildlife biologists point to and the Board of Game and other regulators point to as to a conceptual model for managing moose and predators at a high sustained yield, right? You want a high sustained yield. You want lots of them so people can hunt them. So at low levels, most of Alaska, without any management, is at low levels. So there's few moose because the predators are keeping them down. It's a natural balance. Predators are eating the moose. So in those situations, if you want to have human hunting, you can only harvest this little tiny little blip down here on the left-hand side, that little dash bump. That's how many moose you can harvest theoretically in this conceptual model. But if you take out the predators, most of them or all of them, all of a sudden you get this nice growth rate of moose that climbs up to this high point, and eventually the growth rate will drop off because you're going to get to the carrying capacity, and you can't go beyond that really on an average basis because they'll start starving to death. But you get this high point here, and if you get to that high point, which is the suggested management range, then hunters can have a much larger share of the yield, right, sustained yield, and even wolves can be allowed to come back, and they can have this level, right? So these two curves add up to the top curve. That's the theory. And every wildlife biologist educated when I went to school in the 60s and 70s, and presumably even now, learned that an ecosystem functions better with predators than without. That's what I should have said right there. Okay, so the Board of Game process. It's a public process that's unique to Alaska. The Board of Game is a 7-member board appointed by a governor that establishes wildlife regulations. Fish and Game doesn't do it, the board does. They have 3-year terms, there's no scientific expertise required, and they meet at least 3 times a year. So under them are 84 Fish and Game advisory committees. These are local, they're elected locally within communities, no scientific expertise required, and they propose and comment on regulations. Oops, we got a failure to. Okay, now we get to the Department of Fish and Game. The commissioner is appointed by the governor. It does have professional wildlife researchers and wildlife managers. There are 25 area biologists which manage areas. They're kind of broad-based people. There are also a number, I don't know how many, 15, 20, maybe more, wildlife researchers that study the wildlife and the processes that give that information then to the wildlife managers to help manage. The wildlife managers are managing people almost as much as they are wildlife, right? The researchers are looking at wildlife. So these biologists interact with the public, they estimate populations, they enforce hunting and trapping laws. And then another important part of the process is public and special interest groups. And people are allowed to propose regulations, comment on others' proposals, and there's feedback going both ways. And then finally, the Alaska legislature makes the laws that can override all of these, right? We're going to get to that in a minute. And there's another major player in Alaska, and that is the Federal Subsistence Board. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because that's a whole different process, not related to state management. But I'm just going to mention it because it's important. So, intensive management law. What I talked about before was the easy part of managing wildlife. Now we get to the crazy part, intensive management. For a whole generation, Alaska had what I consider, many people consider, the best model for wildlife management in the whole nation. All right? Intensive management law was passed in 1994. The name of it is an act relating to the powers of the Board of Game and to intensive management of big game, which are those 3 species, to achieve higher sustained yield for human harvest. Okay, it basically came in 2 parts, two statutes or regulations. One of them was the Board of Game shall adopt regulations to restore the abundance or productivity of identified big game prey populations as necessary to achieve human consumptive use goals in areas where consumptive use of game is a preferred use. You can imagine that's most of Alaska. The depletion of big game or reduced productivity has occurred that may result in a significant reduction in the human harvest. And enhancement or abundance of productivity of the big game prey population is feasible using basically prudent active management techniques, the things I talked about earlier. Okay. All right, this is part 2. The Board of Game may not significantly reduce the taking of an identified big game prey population, moose, caribou, deer, by adopting any customary regulations unless the board has adopted regulations that provide for the intensive management to increase the take of the population for human harvest. That's the ringer right there. And a couple of definitions are important. So sustained yield in the Constitution means something different than how they define sustained yield in the Constitution just means don't overharvest things, Alaska Constitution. But sustained yield in the intensive management law means the achievement and maintenance in perpetuity of the ability to support a high level of human harvest of game, right? And a high level of human harvest means to allocate enough animals to achieve a high probability of success for human harvest. So we know the success rate is about 1 in 4 for resident moose hunters. Is that high? I don't think so. So it kind of ignored, the intensive management law kind of ignores the fact that where numbers of hunters are increasing and where the demand is high, the success rate will never be high, right? You're getting yourself into a kind of a bad situation here. So just in summary, the intensive management law requires Fish and Game through the Board of Game to habitat enhancement, often wildfires for moose, harvest regulatory changes, and predator control. So challenges of intensive management. The Alaska Board of Game and the Department of Fish and Game lack the authority to manipulate habitat outside of state game refuges, which are mostly marshes and tide flats, and therefore predator control has become the state's default intensive management technique. And predator control is not popular with the majority of the public. Public initiatives banned aerial shooting, for example, in 1996 and 2000, but those were overturned by the legislature. No other state or province has an intensive management law. We're unique in that regard. Intensive management is very expensive, and it must be repeated indefinitely unless all the predators are removed, like happened in the lower 48, for example. And there's no uncontested evidence that predator control works, except in limited instances like on islands where all the predators can be killed. So let's get back to this maximum sustained yield idea. When they were crafting this law, the intensive management law, Lieutenant Governor Jack Coghill insisted that the clear meaning of sustained yield in the Constitution was basically to provide a high or maximum sustained level of consumption for humans. And if that was so, then I think the framers of the Constitution would have chosen to use maximum sustained yield. They didn't. Unfortunately, however, many hunters and politicians still believe sustained yield means maximum sustained yield. And as I said before, maximum sustained yield is a theoretical concept. Populations cannot be harvested at a maximum level in the real world without unintended consequences because the environment and other factors are constantly fluctuating. Most scientists know that, most politicians don't. So let's go through this one more time. Maximum sustained yield assumes that scientists can accurately, that's the key word, estimate existing population levels with limited funding. Well, that's also key word, limited funding. Oops, I went too far, I think. Nope. Scientists can accurately recognize when the population is at a maximum sustained yield. Regulatory bodies like the Board of Game will act promptly to curtail harvest when those levels are reached. Never happens in the real world. And scientists can accurately then identify the levels at which recovery is sufficient to permit harvest to resume. So none of those are achievable in the real world. There was a great article written about 10 years ago in the Journal of Marine Science that basically summed up what maximum sustained yield is all about. And I quote, "It began as a policy. It was declared to be a science, and then it was enshrined in law." So let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty here. This is a little bit busy map, but I think it'll be easy to understand. So if you look at the pink areas on the map are places where the Board of Game has now identified them as positive or eligible for intensive management. The pink areas are basically all the caribou herds in Alaska, right? They're all eligible for intensive management. The crosshatched areas are moose, and that's most of the moose habitat in Alaska, except for some of these white areas on here that you see, which are, I think, primarily national parks, where they're not allowing hunting anyway. And then finally, the dark gray, mostly in southeast, in Cordova, Prince William Sound, Kodiak, are deer. So pretty much all the deer range has also been identified as positive or eligible for intensive management. So the Board of Game depended on each area biologist to come up with population objectives and harvest goals based on their data, right? For each of these areas. So just as an example, this was my area. You all know where the Anchorage Bowl is over here. This is all the Anchorage management area. Smallest management area in the state, but I had the most people, so pity me. The red and the orange are the moose hunting areas. So we had a bunch of different little moose hunting areas all around. So that's the area. So this is the data I had basically. And I had data going back another 10 or 20 years on moose harvest and population estimates. So looking at the green, right, and looking at the right-hand side of the graph there, those are the number of moose harvested. So each year, the green show that, so 100 to 150, kind of in that range. Now, before 1994, those numbers were quite a bit higher, 50% or even double moose harvested in the Anchorage area. I'll tell you about that in a second. So I took those figures, including the figures from the 90s and the 80s, and said, well, our harvest objective needs to be somewhere between 90, the blue lines here, blue dash lines, and 270. So 90 and 270. I picked those as being reasonable. And this is high because it was so high back in the 90s, the harvest was. And if you look at the annual surveys, we didn't do them annually because we didn't always have the snow, but so the red line is our moose population estimates going up and down. It was very high back in the 90s and 80s. In fact, it was higher than the carrying capacity. Remember, we talked about that. So all of a sudden in 94, we got a bad winter, a couple of bad winters in a row, and half of the moose in Anchorage bull died. Or not just the bull, but the whole, whole area. Half of them died of starvation. So we decided, well, we need to manage that herd at a slightly smaller level. So we came up with a population objective between 1,500 and 1,800, right? And so we finally got it down to that, and everything's clicking along fine. Now, the Board of Game would not have been happy with these low harvest rates, right, all the way down to 90. But we said, well, we're going to add in the moose that are killed by cars every year in Alaska, in Anchorage, which is about 150 a year, right? So all of a sudden, boom, our harvest, most of those are harvested for people's food. So our harvests were quite high, really. So that's how it was done. It was a can of worms. It was seat of the pants, just like a lot of fish and game wildlife research and, not research, but management is done in the state. All right. Meanwhile, many scientists were skeptical that intensive management would work. So Governor Tony Knowles in 1997 commissioned the National Research Council, a whole bunch of scientists, to evaluate previous attempts at predator control in Alaska. They found lots of problems. They said, and they made lots of recommendations. They said future experiments should be based on more thorough assessments and designed so causes of subsequent changes can be determined. And they said, before any predator management efforts are undertaken, the status of the predator and prey populations, including the carrying capacity, should be evaluated. So what's happened in the last 20 years? Here's what's happened. Again, a busy graph, map, but I think you can understand it. So let's look at the crosshatch areas first. Kind of starting from the upper right-hand corner of the state, all the way down to the Kuskokwim Delta, there's a bunch of brown cross-hatching. Those are national wildlife refuges. There's also some wildlife refuges, national wildlife refuges, Kodiak, Unimak Island, kind of down in here. Now, the other crosshatch ones, they're going, the cross-hatching this way, and it's black, kind of in northern Alaska, central Alaska, and southeast, and so that's Wrangell, St. Elias, Denali, places like that. Those are national preserves and parks. Falling behind here on this thing. And then if you look at the colors, so yellow is what the Board of Game has now determined to be a area designated, authorized for wolf control. The green areas are where wolf control is active, or it was active a few years ago. They kind of dodge in and out, but so this graph is never quite right. I can't keep up with it. But basically, the yellow and green are wolf control areas that the board has designated. The brown, the dark brown, are grizzly bear, brown bear control areas, basically those three areas there. And the gray, which is large area over in Tyonek, very large areas, black bear control. And then finally, the pink is both bears, black bears and brown bear control areas. This down here is the Mulchatna, which John will talk about in a minute. So this area, these colored areas where predator control programs are active or were active a few years ago, that's larger than 25 states, all told. So has IM been successful? After 30 years, I don't think it really has. I had a whole bunch of examples, which we don't have time for, to take my word for it, but let me just show you one. And that is the Nelchina Basin. Hello. I might need help, Moses. Oh, okay, whoops. I got partway there, one more. You're welcome to stand right here by me and click this thing.
You're clicking on this one, right?
Yes.
Okay, so just turn it off, turn it back on.
Ah,
Is it okay
very
if you
good.
stand more in the center? It'll work better over there.
I can try, yeah.
This room?
Okay, so let's just look at this. This will just take a minute. So, have I gotten there yet? I haven't gotten there yet. There I am, okay. Whew, So the map, this is the Unit 13. We're going to talk about predator control on moose harvest, the effects. Unit 13 goes from the Matsu Valley down by Palmer all the way up to the Alaska Range, and it goes from Denali on the left here all the way down to Wrangell St. Elias, right? So it's a huge area, huge part of south central Alaska. So if you look at the last 60 years, both the bear and the wolf seasons harvests have been liberalized. In other words, the Board of Game has not necessarily always had predator control, but they've liberalized. You're allowed to shoot more bears, more moose, blah, blah, blah. So they've liberalized the seasons. And what's happened in that time period is, if you look at this top graph on the right, the red is the brown bear harvest and the black is the black bear harvest. Oh, back in the 70s, it was around 50, 60, kind of in that area right there. And it's been liberalized so much that now we're harvesting over 150 or so a year, 150 to 200 black bears and brown bears, right? If you look at the bottom graph on the right, the red triangles are the number of wolves killed, right? So back in the 60s, 70s, wasn't very many because there weren't very many. They were poisoning them back then, right? Moose numbers were pretty high back then. But after poisoning stopped with statehood, numbers kind of went up. And then in here is where some active predator control happened. They were shooting lots of wolves from the air there. And then 2000 is when intensive management took over, right? You think, oh, holy cow, the moose are going to go through the roof. Well, the number of wolves kind of went down harvested because there weren't as many. They shot a whole bunch of them back here, right? But what happened to the moose? 70s, 60s, high numbers. They probably crashed because they were over the carrying capacity, right? They got down to here, and with all this bear control and all this wolf control, you had a slight increase in the number of moose over the years, and then probably another bad winter. I'm not sure what happened. In fact, the carrying capacity here may be over 1,000. I don't know. Anytime it gets above 1,000, all of a sudden you got problems with moose. So now the moose are way down here, and they've slowly crawled back up to about 1,000. I would say that after 50 or 60 years, there hasn't been a whole lot of success with intensive management and predator control in Unit 13. In fact, only 2 years in right here, these two little blue dots on the right-hand side that are above the 1,000 mark, right? 1,000 on the left side here. Those 2 years are the only years that they've achieved their harvest objectives in Unit 13. So they've got them set too high. And then finally, before I segue on to John, it's expensive. Intensive management's expensive. And I just found these figures for 3 years and document. And so about $3 to $5 million a year for intensive management. And that's about a third of the annual budget for personnel and operations in some regions of the state. Okay, John, your turn.
Thank you, Rick. Instead of putting that over my ear, I'm just going to wing it here with this mic, and we will. Okay. Since the intensive management law was enacted in 1994, hunting and trapping regulations for wolves and bears have been substantially liberalized. So there are two types of predator control regulations. Under the intensive management law, predator control can occur only after a detailed assessment and only in a limited area with special techniques, like shooting wolves from the air, or, and we'll talk about shooting bears from the air. This does not include the far larger areas where hunting regulations are being liberalized by the Board of Game to reduce predators. And several colleagues and I have written about this in peer-reviewed journals, and this is a real concern. Okay, hear me better. This is a real concern because it's not considered predator control, but it's still, when you're allowing no close season, or you're allowing females with cubs to be shot, or you're allowing the sale of hides and skulls. I mean, those things really increase harvest, but it's not considered predator control. And let's see, there we go. So as Rick talked about, a major part of the state is open to intensive management. Well, this is just looking at brown bears. And you see the orange area at the bottom of the screen, Aleutian Islands, Kodiak, Kenai Peninsula, South Central Alaska down to Southeast. For brown bears, they're managed as big game trophies. So there isn't real intensive management going on there. But all the white areas to the north, most of those areas allow intensive management, which can just be an increase in seasons and bag limits, and it's had an impact on bears. And the white area represents about 83% of the state. So let's just look at the Board of Game. From 1993 to 2020, the Board of Game liberalized regulations for brown bears 253 times, and the board restricted hunters 6 times. Longer hunting seasons, larger bag limits. Originally, to take a brown bear, if you're a resident, you could take one brown bear every 4 years. And now there's some places where you can take a brown bear every 2 years. I mean, you can take 2 bears every year. So these liberalizations have had an effect. Larger bag limits, allowing harvest of females and cubs, allowing baiting of bears, talk more about that in a minute, shooting from snow machines, and allowing hides and skulls to be sold. So the top graph are brown bear kills from about 1985 to 2020. The bottom graph are black bear kills. Don't worry about the details. Just look at the red bar. So you can see that the number of bears killed, both black and brown bears, have substantially increased over time. And the decline that we see after 2015 could be due to a decline in bear abundance, or could be disinterested hunters that they've got enough bear rugs hanging on the wall and they don't need any more. Saturated demand. We don't know what that is. Very expensive to monitor populations of bears. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kenai Peninsula. The map on the right, John Morton, who used to work for Fish and Wildlife Service on the Kenai. You recognize the Kenai Peninsula. The light green area is the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. The brown area to the left of the Kenai are, native corporations' lands, private lands. This is an area that has an extensive road system and fairly, good density of humans. The far right would be Kenai Fjords National Park, and I like to think that brown bears in particular, are caught between the road system and a cold spot. The glaciers on the right and the road system on the left. It puts brown bears in a squeeze. There are black bears there too. Now, small isolated populations are at greatest risk. Remember we talked about bears early on in our session, I think session number 3. They have brown bears particularly have very low reproductive rates. And small populations that are isolated are at much greater risk of having challenges like Yellowstone Park. We spent millions of dollars with a threatened population of grizzly bears there. And grizzly bears in the lower 48 are still listed as threatened. The Kenai Peninsula, researchers have found that they're genetically distinct from the mainland populations. So there's very little interspersal of populations from the mainland of Alaska moving on to the Kenai. So if you reduce the number of bears here, that's a problem. So let's just look. This is the Kenai Peninsula brown bear kill from 1973 to 2018. And when I say kill, the blue bars represent sport harvest. The red bars represent other forms of human-induced mortality. Roadkill, defense of life and property. You can kill a bear that's breaking into your house to get into your refrigerator or your chicken coop. or to protect your life. That's perfectly legitimate. You can see the red bars are increasing. And the more people, the more roads, the more vulnerable bears are, both black and brown bears, and you remember that from our talk on bears. In recognition of this isolated population on the Kenai, you see that little yellow horizontal line on the right side, just above the red bars. In 1998, the Department of Fish and Game listed the brown bear population on the Kenai as a population of special concern because it's isolated, because it's a small population. John Martin from the Fish and Wildlife Service on the Kenai, using DNA analysis, estimated that there were 582 brown bears on the Kenai. Well, maybe half of those are females, and you know that a female doesn't give birth until she's 6 years old. They have cubs every 4 years, an average of 2, 1 to 4. You can see that you've got a small number of females, that population isn't going to grow very fast, especially where you've got lots of hunting and where you've got defensive life of property. Garbage attracting bears is a real issue. We have it here in the Anchorage Bowl. The population was listed. In 2011, the Commissioner of Fish and Game took it off that list. I have no idea quite why. In 2013, you see that spike. I think the number of bears killed on the Kenai from all causes was close to 100. So that's not sustainable. In the early days, in the 70s and 80s and so on, you're averaging about 10 bears a year. And then up here, you hit over 100 bears. And the average in recent years has been, 50, 60 bears. And there are more restrictive permitting going on now. That's the Kenai as an example. And I want to shift to the Mulchatna. You're all aware of the big blow up 2 years ago when there were a whole bunch of bears killed out of helicopters on the Mulchatna. So another graph, just bear with me. This is right out of Fish and Game information. This is the Mulchatna newsletter that ADF&G produced in 2021. And in the first aerial survey of Mulchatna caribou, in 1949 was about 1,000. I don't put much weight on that. In 1965, the herd was growing up to about 6,000. 1974, some intensive surveys had the herd about 13,000, and then bang, into the 90s, the herd peaked, the mid-90s, at 200,000. And they're doing a pretty good job of aerial surveys, so they're getting a good idea on this population. It got that high, and then it crashed, just as Rick talked about these, populations going up, they go beyond carrying capacity, and boom. Winter lichens, a number of things with that many caribou, the herd just crashed. And today, Fish and Game is estimating that the herd numbers somewhere between 12 and 13,000. So that's a challenge. Now, the intensive management law. This is the IM harvest objective is determined based on population size in the 1990s, when this population was very high. So we're not achieving those population objectives or the harvest that the department and the board plan to have. This graph, I won't spend much time on it. On the left was the 1980s, a low population. The red are concentrated areas for the Mulchatna herd, and the blue are kind of peripheral areas. You can see in the 90s, population was very high. Now, this is based on a paper that caribou biologists at Alaska Fish and Game published in the journal Rangifer. And it's looking back from about 1860. These are guesses back that far, but they were guessing that the population may have been up around 200,000, and then it dropped. Caribou populations go up and down. You see 1996, the population's up about 200,000. Bang, it drops again. Now, this is Fish and Game information that was provided to the Board of Game in 2020 to establish what are they going to do about the Mulchatna caribou herd. So this graph actually comes out of the presentation made by Fish and Game biologists, and they identified nutritional conditions, fall body condition of female caribou, lactating caribou was lower, the fat accumulation was lower. Brucellosis, it's a disease that causes abortion and problems with calves. The concentration in the Mulchatna herd was very high. Over a third of the cows had that disease. Mortality or evidence of the disease at some time. Mortality out of season harvest accounted to half of the mortality. So the preliminary data that the Fish and Game biologists gave the board suggested that nutritional limitations in forage quality or quantity could be a problem, and then things like disease and carrying capacity. The Board of Game voted unanimously to continue wolf control in the Mulchatna area. I haven't talked about wolf control, I'm focused on bears now, through 2028, and directed the biologists to also shoot black and grizzly bears. So, they killed almost 100 brown bears in that year, and there appears to be no plan to measure carrying capacity or enhance caribou habitat. There's evidence that lichens were hit hard that high, hit hard by the caribou. And then there's also evidence that lichens are being displaced by shrubs because of climate change. And in Northwest Alaska, we know that rain on snow events during the winter creates icing on the tundra, and the lichens are unavailable to caribou at those times. So there are a bunch of things going on. Let's see. Fish and Game doesn't have any plan to treat brucellosis or other diseases, and I'm not sure what they would do, but we know that that's a problem. There are no explicit provisions to monitor predator densities as required by the National Research Council, and Rick got into that earlier. So the immediate plan, excuse me, I'm going back here, having trouble remembering which button I'm supposed to push, same problem Rick had. I guess, you know. Okay, here we go. So the IM population goal is 30 to 80,000. And right now we think they're 12 to 13,000. The harvest goal is 2,400 to 8,000. The current population is 12 to 13,000. So I would say, and I know that Rick would say this too, because we wrote it up and published this in the Daily News commentary, a commentary by 34 retired Alaskan biologists published in the Daily News, August 15, 2023. And I'm going to quote from that. There is weak scientific support for the Mulchatna predator control action. The Mulchatna Intensive Management Program has unrealistic population and harvest goals. I'm going to repeat, unrealistic population and harvest goals. And bear control is unlikely to substantially increase caribou numbers given current nutrition, disease, and illegal harvest issues. Now, the 34 retired biologists that signed this were from Alaska Fish and Game, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, BLM, USGS, and the university. And our combined experience was a mere 1,000 years in Alaska. So, you know, I just want you to understand that there's quite a diversity of opinion on intensive management on the Mulchatna caribou herd. Okay, I'm going to come to this in a minute, just ignore that. So the intensive management program is challenging because it's a prescriptive number. Here's how many animals we want or we think are there, and here's how many we think we can kill, and then the Board of Game passes a regulation, and there is no scientific representation on the Board of Game. And I think that's a problem. So now let me just, I'm coming to the conclusion. Subsistence and sport hunting is allowed on national park preserves and national wildlife refuges, but not on national parks or monuments. National park preserves and national wildlife refuges prioritize the conservation and maintenance of natural wildlife diversity. Right, Sandy? Retired National Park Service, thank you. Well, that's, okay. And natural wildlife diversity is altered by intensive management, especially predator control. So what happens when the Board of Game authorizes intensive management of predator control on lands in national park preserves and national wildlife refuges? Well, this is a gray area, and Rick and I struggled with this. Sandy helped us. Mike Boylan, retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, helped us. This issue is a bit in flux, and this has led to state-federal conflicts, which can occur, and then court cases may ensue. And now we're going to come back to the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge as a case in point. In 2016, to counter the state's predator control effort, the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge, Kenai Refuge, issued new regulations prohibiting certain practices. For example, hunting bears over bait, hunting brown bears and black bears, but if you have a black bear bait station, that's going to attract brown bears too. And remember, the bear population is limited, and lots of things going on, including garbage and killing bears in defense of life and property and so on. So these regulations prohibiting bait were opposed by Alaska and invalidated by the Congressional Review Act before they took effect. And Don Young led that charge in Congress. In 2018, the Fish and Wildlife Service, under the Trump administration, promulgated new regs to further liberalize hunting restrictions on the Kenai. In 2020, a district court upheld Fish and Wildlife Service's authority to prohibit brown bear baiting. The case eventually went to a higher court, which let the case stand. Okay, so we've been talking about intensive management on national park preserves and on national wildlife refuges, but intensive management, and there's a concern over conservation of the bear, the wolf, the black bear resource, and I would say the brown bears are most of greatest concern because of their low reproductive place, especially a place like on the Kenai Peninsula. But intensive management also conflicts with other activities and conservation mandates. For example, wildlife viewing. You know, if you're reducing bear numbers significantly, the people that are going out to view wildlife with the wildlife viewing guides and so on, potentially in park preserves, this happens to be Katmai, then, you know, that's a conflict with them. And even with big game hunters. You know, if you're a big game hunter doing brown bear guiding, you know, your clients want to have really big male brown bears to hunt. And intensive management of bears isn't going to help their industry. Just a sidelight there. So, this really is the conclusion. Alaska wildlife is a public trust resource belonging to all Alaskans, all of us. It's our resource. Alaska's national parks, monuments, and preserves and national wildlife refuges are national interest lands that prioritize the conservation and maintenance of natural wildlife diversity. Now, not only are these Alaska wildlife issues that are our wildlife, but they also have a national interest. So whether you're in the gates of the Arctic National Park or in one of the park preserves or the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, there is a national interest there that must be addressed. Hard to do two things at once here. These national interest lands represent key refugia for sustaining natural populations of wildlife, including bears, wolves, and other predators. So, we have a state law, the intensive management law, and it can be applied on, BLM lands. BLM kind of leaves it to Fish and Game, or Forest Service lands, they leave it to Fish and Game. But on national park preserves and national wildlife refuges, these are really national interest lands. So there's a national interest there, and we need to keep that in mind. So Rick and I, in this presentation, came up with some recommendations. And we kind of figured this out. I think you and I have 48 years combined with Alaska Fish and Game and almost 100 years experience in Alaska. These are our recommendations. Follow the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences guidelines in the management of predators and their prey in Alaska, and conduct predator reductions only under well-designed and adequately funded products that include follow-up monitoring to evaluate results. That's one issue, monitoring to evaluate results that has not been done very well. Second recommendation, review and amend the state's intensive management law to eliminate mandates and provide wildlife managers flexibility in science-based implementation, and also conduct cost-benefit analysis. So again, eliminating mandates and doing a little better job of managing ecologically, not by prescription. Big one. Broaden the Board of Game to include an independent scientist. There is no scientist on the Board of Game. They have had scientists in the past. And tourism and wildlife conservation interest. Tourism's $1 billion industry. Why do people come to Alaska? They come to Alaska to see beautiful country and grizzly bears and wolves and eagles and whales. So, we really need to broaden the Board of Game. Finally, prohibit state intensive management programs on national park preserves and national wildlife refuges without the concurrence of federal managers. It should be a partnership. There could be a time when, you really need to get into a wildlife refuge or a park preserve and do some more intensive management, but you shouldn't do that without the concurrence of the federal managers. So basically, those are our recommendations. This has been kind of a long, detailed presentation. We apologize for that. It's a complicated issue. A couple of quick things here. So I read this last week. This is the mandate for leadership that Project 2025 that the MAGA Republicans have put together for President Trump. And I read chapter 16, and this was in chapter 16. This talks about the Department of Interior in Alaska, lots of details. I recommend anybody that's interested, just Google mandate for leadership and pop. You'll get about 800 pages. But look at chapter 16. So this was one of the recommendations. Revoke National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service rules regarding predator control and bear baiting, which are matters for state regulation. Wow, that's a big recommendation. And are they a matter for state regulation when they're in a national park preserve or a national wildlife refuge? You know, these are your places. You have to answer that question. So I think that's it. Oh yeah, this is just, that's the website address. Just Google mandate for leadership if you're interested. You know, next week we're going to talk, wrap this thing together, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. So this might be worth looking at that chapter 16 before next week. That's it, and Rick and I would be delighted to answer any questions that you have. Yes, just a minute, I'm going to let you speak in the microphone.
Yeah, so just specific on the Mulchatna herd. So if I understand the graph correctly, basically the big spike was an anomaly. That the population level is maybe right in around 13,000, 15,000 animals. That's the carrying capacity. And the state is managing to try to get us back to those years that were like out of this way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that 200,000 was a peak, and likely it resulted in an impact to the habitat, to the winter lichen, and the herd crashed. And I would say that the 12, 13,000 is a low level, but the actual, you know, caribou herds go up and down all the time. The Western Arctic caribou herd numbered 500,000 animals about 10 or 15 years ago. And now it's, you know, down, I think, around 200,000. So herds go up and down. That was a high point. And Fish and Game is managing from not that point, but a little lower point, but higher than we can expect, we can support right now. So as Rick said, you know, you've got all these natural issues like weather, you know, predators, disease, carrying capacity, all of those things are changing. And the biologists that wrote that commentary, and we had a number of caribou biologists go over that or were on that letter, felt that Fish and Game and the Board of Game's population objective is unrealistic. It's too high. It ought to be lower. Does that? Yeah. Any other questions?
Way back in the beginning, Dr. Sennett said something about per capita consumption of wildlife. Had bar chart, vertical bar charts, and those were per capita consumption figures.
Yes.
So there's a whole lot of capitas in the major metropolitan areas, right? So the total volume of wildlife harvest is much higher in urban areas?
No.
No.
There's just so many people in urban areas, like Anchorage has 40%, you know, of the state's population, and Fairbanks and Matsu probably put it up to whatever, 60 or 70% total. And so even though the number of hunters is lower in urban areas, they do hunt, we do hunt, I hunt, John hunts, and we do shoot our share. So, you know, even though we don't eat as much because there's a lot of vegetarians, a lot of people that don't like fish, so they don't, you know, fish for salmon, stuff like that in cities. In the rural areas, pretty much everyone likes fish, right? And pretty much everyone likes game meat, and a lot of people hunt. So that's why those numbers look so different. There may only be one person out of four that's hunting, but everyone's eating a lot of meat and fish. So that's why those numbers are so high in rural areas compared to urban areas like Anchorage and Matsu, where even though there's a lot of hunters here, there's a lot of people that don't hunt and maybe, you know, get a couple of roasts from someone that did hunt, and that's all the meat they eat for wild game in a year.
So let me just be, and I'll get you, let me just be really clear. You know, Rick and I are both hunters. We grew up hunting. You know, I haven't hunted in a couple of years, but hunting is a very justifiable activity, and it can be managed responsibly. And I think the Department of Fish and Game has done a pretty good job overall. The intensive management law, in my opinion, is really a dangerous kind of law. And it's not ecologically sound, and I'll just put it that way.
Thanks. One comment, well, maybe just two comments. One, are you aware that there's a proposal to add Dall sheep into the list? Okay, that's in the current proposal book.
Not surprised.
The proponent is Fish and Game, not the public. So there's more coming. The other thing I would point out as an example of the kind of liberalized regulations, one that I came across was put into effect 2 years ago, is you can now, anywhere in the state, any open season of wolf or wolverine, you can chase those animals on a snow machine, run them to exhaustion, and shoot them. So if you care about fair chase, there's one for your column there. The other thing I would add, Park Service preserves are 22 million acres worth of land. It's a big chunk of real estate.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. Sandy's retired National Park Service. He knows a lot of that stuff. Go ahead. Hello, go ahead for the question.
Oh, is that me? Up here in Zoom? I guess. I don't want to talk out of turn.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, my question was how is the Board of Game set up? I mean, it sounds like that needs to be corrected and changed, but how does that go about being set up or established? How do you get on that?
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It was established, this is Rick, it's established by law, 7-member
Okay.
board, each member is appointed by the governor. They have 3-year terms, they can be reappointed, and there's no scientific expertise required. In fact, a couple of years ago when they were debating the Mulchatna control measures, a large part of the board was hunting big game guides, right? So they have a vested interest, of course, but there are no, tourism people, whatnot. The governors have just never, except Tony Knowles did a little bit. He did appoint a wildlife photographer, I think Joel Bennett, and a few people that were scientists to the board. But since Tony Knowles, which has been a long time, most of my career, the more recent governors have. They like hunters, they like big game guides and trappers on the Board of Game. So it's a pretty biased group to be representing the wildlife interests for everybody in the state.
Yes, thank you. It seems to me too, I agree.
Thank you for your question. We've got another question here.
My question, I think you may have answered it, is what's the average illegal take per year on the Mulchatna?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the number. I do know that the research biologists that testified at the Board of Game, they were providing information, said that from what they could tell, half of the mortality, the annual mortality, was from out of season or illegal harvest. They've closed the season now. There is no human harvest, but it was. Yeah, except for the illegal, and it was fairly high, which was surprising. So, yes.
How does subsistence fit into this, subsistence hunting?
Rick, I'm going to let you handle that. How does subsistence hunting fit into this?
Well, you got time for another whole series of lectures because that's pretty complicated, and Sandy could probably answer better than I, but the state of Alaska has a different definition of what a subsistence person is than the feds, right? So Alaska says you can't be a subsistence user unless you live a certain distance away from big cities, on and on and on. Basically rural areas, right? The feds say, well, if you live in those rural areas, even if you're not native, you're a subsistence user. And there's just different rules. And so it's always a can of worms to get into this because with the feds have a different definition, the state has a different definition, And I lost my train of thought there, but maybe Sandy could help me out.
It is very complicated. The simple thing is, whenever you write the word subsistence, it works better if you put the word state or federal in front of it. Then you'll know which one you're talking about. I'm not sure exactly what words Rick said, but everybody in this room's a state subsistence hunter if you live in Anchorage. We're all state subsistence hunters under state law. Are any of us federal subsistence hunters? If our primary residence is here, no. You have to live in a rural area. The feds have a process to define where those are. And there is no ethnicity in ANILCA that established all the federal areas. If you live in a rural area, the federal board defines it as rural, you're good to go for federal subsistence hunting.
Right, that's right, Sandy. One wrinkle on that is, like you said, that even in Anchorage, the state considers us subsistence users because the state considers everybody to be equal, right? We're all subsistence users, right? But the Board of Game did come up with criteria for sort of how much of a subsistence user you are, right? So if you live in a city like Anchorage or Fairbanks, you get no points for that. If you live in a place like Chickaloon or Nome, you get lots of points. And you get more points for how often you've harvested moose or caribou and things like that. So people who live in cities who hunt maybe every few years, you live in the city, you don't get any points for that. They do this scale thing, right? So really there's a big benefit in the state system to live in a rural area and being a traditional hunter, which is probably a good idea, right? The feds have a different perspective though. They say, if you live in a rural area, the subsistence regulations are for you, you know. If you live in the city, then they're not. So even though Anchorage, as they say, is the largest native community in the state. So it's very complicated.
I had the privilege about 10 years ago or so to serve on the Western Arctic Caribou Working Group. And the Western Arctic herd, as you recall from a session ago or so, once numbered 500,000 animals. And it was very high when I was on the working group, and I actually chaired the management plan. And the Western Arctic herd is utilized by 40 different native villages in Northwest Alaska. And for some of those villages, this is their major sustenance. So they knew that the herd was going to go down at some point. So how are they going to deal with that? So they had some triggers. And I don't remember the details, but when the herd got to be so low, then they recommended that there be no out-of-state hunting. When the herd got lower, they recommended that there only be in-region hunting. So someone from Anchorage that wanted to fly up and go hunting, you know, and there are issues between, you know, state rights and this and that. But they had triggers. And then when the herd got to another level, then it was bulls only. But they kind of planned this out. And, you know, the Mulchatna herd is really important to the local people. And I'm sensitive to that. And I think that there are ways to accommodate those local people without just trying to eliminate all the brown bears.
Well, just curious. I work in that region, and a lot of the native communities very much favor this predator control. But since you guys are the experts, and it doesn't look like the state's going to change anything in the near future, because I think they did it again this year, what's your prediction for what's going to happen out there?
You know, what's the prediction? Boy, I don't know. I think there's some groups that are looking at legal issues. The United Federation of Natives, Alaska Federation of Natives, had a resolution last year to support predator control out there. You know, I think we need some basic biology and some facts to put in front of people. And you know, I think the leadership of Fish and Game at the highest levels and the governor, you know, need to make sure that the Board of Game that doesn't have any scientist on it consider some of these issues. You know, in my opinion, it's very clear that the target population that they want and the target harvest that they want is just not possible right now. It may be possible, 10 years from now. But I think the department and the board need to do a better job of scientifically tracking that population and understanding why it's going up or why it's going down. Yes?
So the question is from Jerry Walters. The question is, can regional corporations control the amount of harvests, hunts, etc. on their lands?
Okay, you heard that. Well, in a way they can, because they can control access to their lands, but they can't control seasons and bag limits. That's for Fish and Game to do. But some regional corporations you can buy a permit to trespass on their lands or to hunt on their lands, but you have to get permission. So that's how they would handle that. Okay, another question.
Lucinda, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I can't disagree with anything you guys have said, but I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned in terms of the other markets for wildlife, as in wildlife viewing and so on and so forth. How much of a case has been made to whoever makes these decisions about the economic benefits of not doing wildlife predator control?
Well, I think that when the Board of Game meets and makes decisions, having access to a resource economist would be a useful thing. Someone from the tourism industry that says that in South Central Alaska, the Kenai Peninsula with Kenai Fjords National Park and Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, there are X number of tourists that go there every year, and what some percentage of them really want to see wildlife. I'm just throwing this out as a hypothetical, and we think that's worth half a billion dollars or whatever it might be. That ought to be in part of the analysis for how do we get the optimal benefit for Alaskans out of our resource management. And I think that wildlands and wildlife are a very high priority value that many, many people value. And and hunting and having food security is another really legitimate issue. And those things need to be looked at. And I think it gets complicated when you're talking about federal subsistence management, and I'm not an expert on that, but it does seem to me that it's logical when the people that live in the Mulchatna area, they should have the priority, first priority on harvesting the resource when the resource is very limited. And it's sometimes, you have to even get reduced significantly. But populations go up and down, as Rick described earlier.
And I have to say that, the Board of Game, I think we've implied it, is a pretty insular group. There is pretty much hunters, trappers, big game guides, for the most part. I mean, that's what they are. That's who the governor appoints. And so they hear from mostly hunters, trappers, and big game guys. That's 99% of their comments on any of these meetings and regulations. That's who they talk to. They talk to them at home, they talk to them on the phone, and they talk to them in meetings. So people that don't like hunting, or people that like bears maybe more than hunting, come to these meetings, and they're kind of roundly ignored for the most part, I have to say, even though it's a public process. And they just haven't, the only time when they've had some success is when we had this, 20 years ago, the big national boycott over aerial control of wolves, right? And so nationally, people were saying, we're not coming to your state and spending money if you don't stop aerial control. And the governor at the time, I believe it was Tony Knowles, or before him, Wally, that's right, even stranger, said, okay, hold off, we're gonna consider this. So anyway, the only way I think, I don't know that the legislature is going to do anything in the right vein. I'm not sure the governor is, but the industries in the state that deal with wildlife watching and stuff have to be able to show their muscle and throw their weight around. And if the Board of Game heard, you know, a lot from these people, if they stormed the meetings and said, well, you know what, you're killing off the bears that my people want to see, and it's going to cost the state, excuse me, millions of dollars. I mean, maybe the Board of Game would start to factor that in.
This is kind of a change of pace question, but I remember years ago when Gordon Haber was around, he did a lot of work on wolves, and he made the comment that if you shoot up a wolf pack, you basically split it up and it makes more wolf packs, and so you're actually increase the number by aerial wolf hunting of wolves. And is that true?
Well, up to a point. You know, what happens is if you shoot the alpha members of the pack, then the subordinate members of the pack will go off and oftentimes have their own dens and create their own pups. So you can have a brief spurt in the number of pups, but if you're shooting the heck out of them every chance you get, those pups are vulnerable too. So it just depends on how much pressure you're putting on the population. Yeah, but wolves do have an amazing capacity to come back. I think, I can't remember, it's been a long time since I looked at this, but it's something like you can shoot 50% of a wolf population from year to year, and they can rebound back. So if you're doing wolf control, you need to shoot 60 or 70 or more percent of the wolves in a large area to get any kind of benefits, if you do get benefits from that.
Yes, wolves are much more resilient than brown bears or black bears, but black bears are more resilient than brown bears. You know, I don't want to have this end in a Debbie Downer kind of situation. So I am really impressed that all of you took your time to come and learn about wildlife. We've got one more class to go, and I think what you can do is to become informed, which you're doing right now, and congratulations to you, and talk to your neighbors, you know, and talk to your family members, and, you know, let them know what you've learned, and talk to your legislators, and, you know, let them know what you're interested in. And, you know, this is your resource. And I think that, you know, we all have an obligation to, you know, do our little part. And I think just, you know, write a letter to the editor, you know, write a commentary, whatever it is. But as you become informed in these issues, I think that you can all have an influence. And as Rick says, the Board of Game is kind of off here, and there aren't many people that go there with your interests. There's some special interests, some conservation groups that go there. But, you know, talk to your neighbors and just, you know, you're getting informed right here. And that's great. I applaud you for that. Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you very much for coming. Oh, one more question. Yeah, lynx is a predator. Mostly it's a trapping issue. And lynx go up and down along with snowshoe hares, kind of lagging.
Lynx eat mostly snowshoe hares and small mammals, so hunters don't really care so much about that. If lynx were twice as big and they ate caribou and moose, then there'd be a intensive management for lynx as well.
Okay, thank you so much for coming.